Well, hello everyone. It is Friday the 26th of January 2024. I am Delbridge, Benchmark Realty, Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and this is your weekly status chat. Now, today's episode is going to be on spin, helping you recognize media bias as it affects the economic news that you're hearing. We don't want to get you to be either overly positive nor overly negative. You need to have the facts. I think the facts is what you want. Now, before I get into that, I want to say there is a program I went to visit with a bank on this week, and the bank itself was telling me that there's a particular program. It's got some grant money. They have increased it. I think they said from $10,000 to $20,000. There are income limits that are going to be related to where the house is, the particular location, county that it's in. It's going to set that limit. There are requirements for it. Sounds pretty reasonable, but it is a first come, first served type situation, and you need a contract on a house before you can proceed with it. Now, there's always the down payment assistance program, but there's some other ones. There's some hero programs. There's some other stuff going on. We need to check that out. We need to get you in your house, get you moving, get her done, and get into 2024 in a reasonable fashion without fear or just blinders on. Now, let's get into today's news, which deals with some of the spin that I was seeing. Now, we know the stock market has hit some high levels here just recently, and the stock market is convinced that we're at peak Fed, and I've heard so many people on social media suggesting that we're going to get up to 7 rate cuts starting in January. Now, we'll find out pretty darn quick because the Fed's just about to meet. Now, we looked at December's beige book. We've looked at some of the other stuff, and it doesn't really look like it's there. The Fed has said we're going to consider this, but they're concerned about both inflation going up, taking back off, reigniting inflation, and also unemployment, because we don't want to have the evil stagflation kick on us. So I think it's more, in my mind, I expect more of a, we're going to do what we actually said we would do, look toward the third quarter or the second half of 2024 before we cut any Fed target rates. Now, the market has already responded, and it's acting as if things are already there because they do have to look long term. So stock market's doing great. Bond market is doing pretty good. Everything is looking fairly strong. In fact, that's part of the news we're going to look at with the PCE news that was released today. But we'll also talk about the CPI news that was recently released, as well as the GDP information that was recently released. And we're going to put these together, and we're going to cut through some of the nonsense and look at some actual facts so that you know what's happening with a little bit more information under your belt, so you're not quite as flying blind in a fog. All right, so let's go ahead and get to that right now. If you like this content, please go to CallDelToSell.com, find the tab that says on YouTube, click it, and it'll open up a page of QR codes. There you can use a smartphone to scan and get to the YouTube page, or you can just mouse over and click it on a PC. There you'll be able to subscribe to this little button over here and click the notification bell so that YouTube will notify you when each Friday's blog has been uploaded. Thank you. Well, let me start this part by saying, no, I don't think the wheels are going to fall off, and I don't think we're going to see any great, magnificent change right off the bat. We have seen that 1.5 point that was built in those longer terms because they thought that rates were going to continue to go up, and they have to hedge their bet. Now, when Fed said we may be done raising rates, we may look at cutting, everybody jumped in and they started rolling that number back off. So we're doing better than we were, and things are still doing pretty good in certain aspects of the economy, not so much in other aspects. So let's look at the screen we have pulled up here. Today, we had the PCE, which is one of the two main things that they look at for inflation. They measure things differently, and they come up with different numbers. Normally, the PCE is lower, and there's a reason for that. And when we look at it, you're after this point, you're going to look at it, well, of course, now I understand one of the reasons why they're different, and this is not a surprise. But the big spin that they were putting on it is that the economy is good, looking toward November of 2024, everything is fine, don't you worry about it, because it has become a huge, huge issue nationwide as we've all gone through this horrible, horrible inflation. And remember, inflation isn't just month to month, that's just the growth of it. We have it from all the way from when the election happened and the printing of the money and the shutdown and all of that stuff that went with it, all of that extra money chasing the same amount of goods, or in some cases a little bit less. And when you have more money chasing the same stuff, you get inflation. That's kind of what the base definition of it is. So when we look at this one, we see we're going to look at this article. We're only going to read the bullet points real quick, but it says 10 hours ago, the core personal consumption expenditures price index was expected to be increased 0.2% monthly in December and 3% from a year. All right, now if we roll down here, we can see several of these that are all kind of touting the same thing, and it's the same information they're responding to. December's PCE inflation data, core numbers dropped more than expected. All right, Fed's favorite inflation gauge rose 0.2% in December and 2.9 over a year. We're below 3%. The battle against inflation is over, some believe, and it's not. It's a different index. It's measuring different things, and 3% wasn't the target anyway. 2% was. Now, when we look at this, we will have periods in a normal economy when inflation goes up and down in a healthy economy. Sometimes it may ease towards 30, but we're coming off of some pretty high numbers, some 9s and 8s and 9s way back. And so they do accumulate to us, and they put a hurt on our wallet. Here's some more. Fed dips. Intel's disappointing outlook. PCE ahead. What's moving? We can look at that with investing.com. They're usually pretty good. Market Watch is pretty good, I think. Stock market today, Dow gains after PCE post mild 0.2% rise in December. We're not going to read those. We're just going to look at this first one, and then we're going to look at some of the news we had earlier in this week and see if it really looks like it's time that we're going to get, and I don't know where they come up with this number, seven rate decreases starting in January. We'll know that soon enough. It's just around the corner. But we also have to look at those jobs numbers, because that's the other thing the Fed is concerned with. The Fed, if we start going into layoffs, substantial layoffs, then that will probably get the Fed to want to do some stimulus or some QE and start printing some money, basically. It's undoing everything we just spent a year trying to get a hold of. They may reverse that from tightening to easing, and then that's when we're kind of in this strange la-la land of where are we actually going. So that's what we got coming up. Let's look at this article, and I'll show you one of the warning signs. And remember, we haven't seen the labor numbers yet. We don't know if they're going to be good or they're bad. The Beige Book warned us that December, some of the 12 districts saw some tightening on the horizon. They were seeing basically new jobs that were open have been pulled off the market. They're not going to get filled, and they're not laying anybody off. We've seen some hour shifts from full-time to part-time, but it's really not looking too terribly bad. So I think my guess is they're going to continue doing what they've been doing and just hold off and keep their original target date of Q3. So I don't expect much, but I could be wrong. They may see something in the labor numbers that are coming out that we don't see. This title up here is really just a bullet point below, and I want to give credit CNBC, Jeff Cox, Friday, January 26, 8 a.m. this morning, 8:30 actually. So it says the core personal consumption expenditure price index for December, an important gauge for the Federal Reserve, increased 0.2% on a month and was up 2.9% on a yearly basis. So we were hearing a lot of spin. Look, it's below 3%. We're there. Everything's great. We're going to see the rates cut because we've controlled inflation. Including volatile food and energy costs, headline inflation also rose 0.2% for the month and held steady at 2.6% annually. This next one is the one I want you to pay attention to, and I'm going to highlight it here with the little mousy guy. It says consumer spending increased 0.7%. That spending increased 0.7%, stronger than the 0.5 estimate. So it's more than expected. We're still spending more than expected. Personal income growth edged lower to 0.3% in line with the forecast. The Fed is expecting the labor market to tighten up and some of the price pressures on labor to companies to ease, and we're seeing a little of that, but it's not exactly going down the tubes real fast. So it's kind of, I think, a hold the current course type thing. Now, I have another one here. It's the personal consumption expenditure. This is from the BEA. The purpose of this is just to show you this is another government index. It's produced out of the government with their data that they have access to. And it says it's released each month in the personal income and outlays report, reflects changes in the prices of goods and services purchased by consumers in the United States. Quarterly and annual data are included in the GDP release. And it shows that we didn't change any from December. We were 2.6% last month, which would actually be November, and then of course the month we just closed out, December, 2.6, and it's down a little bit, but we haven't exactly hit that 2% goal just yet. Well, let's look at some of the earlier news that we had this week, which was the GDP. Now, I don't know if you remember, we were on a slow taper as we were expecting. by the quantitative tightening to kind of slow down the economy and take care of the GDP. GDP is the main measurement they use, although some may use GDI, gross domestic income, as a better indicator. Some think it's better, but the GDP is the historic one we use. And when we hit Q3, this one right here, what did we see? We were expecting down around 2.25, something like that, and it came in about twice that at 4.9%. So then there was some thought, well, there's just some panic buying, people trying to get some stuff bought, taken care of before the prices continue to rise too high, and they're just spending money early. But we'll see it cut off in the following quarter. And so right after the third quarter results, GDP, were given, they cut the fourth quarter expectations down about 1%. And they said, well, we may get it up closer to 2. And what did it actually come in at? It came in at 3.3%. So we are seeing something in the economy, that the economy is still going. People are still spending the money. Incomes are not keeping up. How are they doing this at this point in time? And I believe a lot of it's because they're just maxing out the credit cards. And I think once you get to a point where your balance is so high that you just hate to open the envelope, hate to look at the computer, that there's a point where you just give up ever paying it off. And especially with the higher rates tied to credit cards, I think we're going to see significant defaults come up. And I think people are in a mode, a certain number of people, I don't know what percentage, are just spending until they get cut off. And at that point, they may actually have to reconcile that account with some form of agreement or default. So we are seeing credit card defaults come up. We've looked at that, but they're still spending, and that's the thing that we really want to look at. So the next thing I want to look at is the CPI, because the CPI did not come in below expectation. It actually was doing, I think, a little bit more than they wanted. It's from the government, the BLS, and I'll slide this up. We've looked at this a number of times, this basic picture. Now, what I want to talk to you about spin. Now, you know that the news, that the government and politics runs the economy, and we do have election issues. They're real. They're not being political. It's part of politics, how economics and politics affects the people, how it affects your life. They like to say everything is great. Don't worry. Don't, like Wizard of Oz, don't look behind the curtain. Just keep looking at the big scary thing in front of you. Well, here, when we look back at this, how many times would we see, depending on how this broke out in the CPI, I think it gives them more spin room, which is one reason it gets so much press. Because when the government decided that we were going to shut down oil explorations, and today they're going to shut down, because of environmental concerns, some liquid natural gas projects, and they're cutting everything down. They want to kill oil to some extent. That's the narrative. And our oil prices shot way up for a while. When they were way high, we didn't want to look at energy. We wanted to look at this green blob over here, the all items less food and energy, because energy was so ridiculously high. Then we had, for a while, over here in food, we had the avian flu, and they were having to terminate large batches of chickens because they didn't want the virus to spread over and over, so they nip it in the bud. And egg prices went up, and cream cheese prices went up, and all kind of stuff were going up, so they didn't want to look at food. So they went right back to this all items less food and energy, and that's what they wanted you to concentrate on, because it looked better than the all items index over here. But let's see what we've got. They reported all items this in December to be 3.4%, and you heard a lot about that 3.4%. Why? Because it's better than the all items less food and energy, which is the core, at 3.9%. So we're just about 2 times the Fed's desired inflation based upon the CPI core. Now, they'll flip it depending on which one makes them look better between the core and all items. And so you've got to pay attention to what they're saying, because when they're saying, look over here on the left hand, you better be looking to see what the right hand is doing. So we do see that the CPI came in for December, same time period, was significantly higher. And I got to reposition the screen before we go to this next one, but we're going to go back over and we're going to look to see what it says. CPI for all items rose 0.3% in December, shelter up. This is 11th of January. So this is not the old, this is December's data. Let's click in this, and what we see, if I can pull it down here, pull up, this is obviously the BLS. I've got it up here. Same thing, it's just on their same page. We're going to pull it up, and we're going to look for this line right here. The index for shelter continued to rise in December. Now, shelter, I'm not an expert at CPI. I understand it to include rents and mortgages, and even some extended stay type situations where it is shelter. It's what it says it is. It's shelter, not necessarily specifically housing, but pretty darn tied to housing. Contributed to over half the monthly all items increase. So of that 3.4%, was it? Of that 3.4%, most of it, over half of it was relating to shelter. So why is the PCE saying below 3? Now we can go through all this. We've done that on a previous show. There's no reason to go back to that. So let's reposition our little screen here back where it was, and we'll pull up the next thing. What is the difference between the PCE and the CPI, and why does the Fed like one and not like the other? Well, here we are. This is from the White House. This is a few months back. This is September 29th of 2023. But it's answering the question, what is the difference between the PCE and the CPI? Well, I think the CPI is easier to spin because we can talk about the core or the total. But what I'm going to get down here, why we should never be surprised that the PCE is running lower than the CPI is, first of all, the CPI measures urban cities type area. Urban, well, that's where you're going to find the cities, versus the PCE, which is more national trend. But here I have it. PCE also weights item differently than the CPI. And the figure shows this difference to be more consequential, with the PCE weight leading to lower measures of inflation so far this year. So the PCE is going to underreport inflation compared to the CPI. This implies the PCE gives less weight to prices that have been growing more quickly than the CPI over the period. Again, the Fed likes the PCE, even though the PCE has some limiting factors in how it represents actual inflation, the inflation that you and I feel when we have to go buy some eggs or some chicken or some steak or whatever we have to, or gas, oil, or have to put a roof on the house or whatever we're paying for. Now in red, I've got it highlighted. Housing is an evergreen example of this difference. Housing makes up 33% of the CPI basket of goods, but only 15% of the PCE. In August specifically, the lower weight of gasoline prices in the PCE explained about 0.1%, nearly half of the growth of the PCE CPI wedge between July and August. So they're trying to explain to you a little bit of why they're different. And I'm going to demonstrate it to you with a historical record by pulling up both of them over on the FRED, one of our buddies, the Federal Reserve Economic Data. This is St. Louis puts it out. We look at a lot of our stuff. Our GDP now comes out of Atlanta, but this one comes out of St. Louis. And what we see is the red up here is the CPI for all urban customers in the United States average. And the blue is the PCE, chain type price index, it says. Now, if we just pull my mouse away, you can see that the red usually is higher, the CPI is usually higher than the PCE, but not always. Look here. Look back here after the Ford and Carter years, and then Reagan corrected the economy, we actually brought that down. What could cause that? Well, we see as we expect. Housing is weighted heavier. Housing happens to be, most of our people that we know, housing tends to be one of their biggest expenses. Their cars are their next biggest expense. A house and a car are some place to stay and some way to get to and from a job are pretty fundamental for most Americans. And so we've been talking a little bit about vehicles and used car markets, new car markets. There's been a huge dip in wholesale prices on automobiles. That could be a different show. I could talk for hours at this stuff. But here we see the 208 problem that we had when we had the housing bubble and the housing meltdown. We see the red, which weights this, that would be the CPI, weights housing heavier in its index than the PCE. But you see, once we got on the other side of it and all of that nastiness happened, what did we see right there at that point, that inflection point? We see the housing weighted higher in the CPI, and after the housing started to collapse over those 2 years, the prices fell, and all those underwaters and auctions and whatnot happened. Then, because it was still weighted higher, we got an abnormal drop in housing cost. But because it's weighted less in the PCE, you see it's actually higher. It actually shows less deflation than we saw in July of 2009. So I want you, if you watch this show, like and comment, obviously. I've got the two things I have to put in there each time just to make sure, because it deals with real estate. I keep Tennessee Real Estate Commission happy, and you know how to find me and all that kind of wonderful stuff. But the other factor is there's a lot of spin. People will spin you up or spin you down, depending on what they have. And the reality is we're not in a normal cycle yet. We're not in a normal cycle yet. Our inflation is still twice what it needs to be, what they want it to be. The optimism is early and I think unsubstantiated that we're going to have 7 rate cuts starting in January. We might see one, but if we see one there, it's just one that they move forward. I don't think we're going to see a whole bunch of them. I don't think they like to jerk the wheel. The Federal Reserve does not like to jerk the wheel on the economy. So I think that's where we are. I don't expect to see anything next week. A lot of this is going to depend on what the Fed sees in the labor numbers. If we start to see massive layoffs, they might try to counteract that. I don't think they're there yet. I think we're just beginning to see the layoffs. So I take the Fed at its word. Q3 will be when they'll actually knock that target rate down. But there's a lot of other emotional responses. The bond market is doing what it's doing. Stock market is at record highs. So we're doing well because people are spending. But I think they're spending on plastic because their incomes haven't come up. Our savings are dipping way low. Expect defaults on the plastic first, then the all-consumer loans, the car loans to go next. The very last thing they're going to let go, that the typical American will let go, is going to be their home if they have it. So let's wrap this show up with some numbers and be done. Hello, I'm Delbridge of Benchmark Realty, Murfreesboro, Tennessee. If you are currently unrepresented and would like to know how to compare up to 3 properties side by side and room by room, then go over to my new YouTube channel, CallDelToSell. That's 1 L and Del, no spaces. Watch the demo on Real Scout and then call me and we'll set up your exclusive ad-free account today. All right. Last week's numbers, week ending the 19th of January 2024, we had 18,381 opportunities in the Middle Tennessee area through our MLS type, pulled off of the Real Scout system. That dipped down just a tad. We were 3256 in the under contracts still showing. That went up a little bit over the previous period, and so did the integer relation between those two, between the opportunities, what are coming soon and what are on the market now, and the ones that actually have contracts, but they're still showing them in case something happens perhaps, or for whatever reason they have. That ratio went up to 18%. This week is going to be the same at 18%, but we have a decrease in on markets or coming soon to 18,441, not significant, and 3306 where you're under contracts still showing. So with that, not a lot of change going on in the market. It's still trucking along, and I think we're going to be all right compared to the rest of the nation, but we really need to watch the auto industry, and we need to watch those labor numbers and keep up with what we can, because spending is still going strong. So we might see 7, but I don't think we will. Some people say 5. I don't know where they get that number from. The Fed mentioned 3 or more, at least 3, they said, starting in the last half of the year. And I don't see anything in today's data that's going to change that. But we have a Fed meeting this month, and we'll find out soon enough. Stay tuned. Keep watching. Appreciate you. Tell your friends. I need some more people watching this to get the algorithms to bump it a little bit more for me. So we appreciate you watching. Have a great weekend.